On World Population Day, the United Nations calls for investing in women and girls to end poverty. Seen as cost-effective and smart economics, could empowering women alone help slow population growth? Is the UN dressing up the world population problem, an issue too sensitive to tackle head-on? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. 6.8 billion people, that's the world's population, and it continues to grow by approximately 80 million people each year. At this rate, by 2050, the global population will reach 9.1 billion. That's 36% more than of today's population. This growth is accompanied by unparalleled challenges like climate change, food and water shortages, and a severe energy crisis. Is the world ready? The United Nations Population Fund issued its annual report on Saturday, marking World Population Day. The focus of this year's report: fight poverty, educate girls. The report highlights approximately 1/4 of the over 600 million girls in the developing world are not enrolled in school, and the ones that do enrol rarely make it through to secondary levels. The report emphasised that investing in women will help set the stage for economic recovery and reduce inequality and poverty. Now, some argue that since World War II, no country has gone from developing status to developed status without first reducing birth rates and population growth rates, which enables couples to save a higher percentage of their income and invest it in education, leading to increased economic productivity, greater employment and higher incomes. While large families tend to spend all of their income on immediate consumption needs. Well, the United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon called on decision-makers to protect women's ability to earn income, keep their daughters in school and obtain reproductive health information and services, including voluntary family planning. He said, "Together, let us advance the rights of women and girls and empower them as highly productive members of society, capable of contributing to economic recovery and growth. There can be no better investment on this day or any other." Well, joining me on the programme are our guests. In New York, Dr. Azhar Karam. She's a senior advisor at the United Nations Population Fund. In Denver, filmmaker Dave Gardner. He's currently working on a documentary entitled Hooked on Growth, Our Misguided Quest for Prosperity. And in New Delhi, India, Pranab Sen, Chief Statistician of India and part of India's National Statistical Commission. Dr. Karam, let me come to you first. One thought from the Population Think Tank website, and I mentioned it in the introduction there, that since World War II, no country has gone from developing status to developed status without first reducing birth rates and population growth rates. Lots of blogs, lots of websites discussing World Population Day. Is this a valid statement?
It's a valid statement insofar as the reality that no country has indeed gone from developing to developed without investing significantly in health, education for women, and making sure that there were employment opportunities and access to human rights of women throughout.
Dave Gardner, can I come to you in Colorado? I mean, do you feel that the Secretary General's comments or message this year was any different from his predecessors, and that he's on the right track when talking about investing in women?
Well, he is on the right track in terms of the fact that that is a very important work and it has proven to be very effective. But I believe there is so much more we need to do. It is setting the bar a little low and actually tiptoeing around the issue of overpopulation. Unfortunately, I think we live in a world where it's become politically incorrect to address overpopulation head on, and one of the reasons I'm producing the film Hooked on Growth is to break down that taboo about talking about overpopulation.
Pranab Sen, can I just bring you in here from New Delhi, and certainly the issue about women. From your own position as a statistician, how important was that statement from the UN Secretary General?
It's critically important. I mean, it's possibly one of the most unexceptionable statements anybody could make. The real question is that what are its implications regarding population growth? I mean, if that is the topic that we're discussing today. And that, I think, is something hopefully we'll carry on in this program.
Dave Garland, I'm going to come back to you because the whole issue is about population growth. And the mere mention of population control sort of brings fear into the corridors of government, perhaps even the UN. It's a difficult one because you have to not only navigate the common sense attitude to population growth, but you have to navigate cultural and religious minefields.
Well, that is very true, and like I said, it's a taboo that we've got to break down. And as much as I want to compliment the United Nations for the work that they're doing, and it is important work, it would help if we could embolden them and embolden other organizations such as Sierra Club to be more honest and frank in their discussing the very fact that the number of people on the planet today cannot be supported sustainably by the Earth. And I feel like, how many couples today are conceiving their third, fourth, or fifth, or sixth child and maybe don't even know that the Earth is overpopulated, that it's overstressed, that we're in overshoot? The more we talk about it, the more we can inform people, the less likely we are to reach a point where we actually have to consider population control.
Dr. Karam, in New York, I mean, the more you talk about it, sometimes the more closed off some groups seem to be, whether they be government or religious groups. In terms of the cultural and religious minefields that the UN has to navigate when talking about population growth. In South America, you might, for example, have the Catholic Church very opposed to any particular statements made by the UN. You might go into the Middle East or South Asia and you have various religious groups very concerned, perhaps, about what the UN may say. Tell me what your concerns are.
Well, I think the facts speak for themselves. I think we have a situation where research shows us that maternal deaths are continue to be at an all-time high. We have 500,000 women dying per year as a result of complications during childbirth. The majority of those complications from which women die at the rate of 1 a minute are completely preventable and treatable. And we know that for every 1 woman who dies during childbirth, 20 women are impacted upon through disabilities which last them a lifetime. We also know that if we were to invest in family planning, we would reduce the number of maternal deaths by 40% a year. And we know that where maternal deaths occur, the world loses approximately $15 billion a year of productivity. So I don't think that it's so much an issue of culture or religion. I think it's simply an issue where scientific evidence points to the need to ensure that we reduce maternal deaths at all costs. And in order to do so, we need to do some very smart investment. And family planning, voluntary family planning, now more than ever, is a very smart investment.
Pranam Sen, can I bring you in from New Delhi? I mean, it's, as you say, it has to be common sense, scientific, but in a country like India, where religion does play a very strong role, from your research, what has the attitude been from the public to population control, and what's been done by the Indian government to placate various religious groups over it?
I think the religious factor is overestimated. I don't think it's quite as bad as people make out to be. The real question is whether the idiom in which the message is being sent really is sensitive to the idiom that people are willing to listen to. You know, frankly, the idea of trying to sell, prevention of maternal death on economic grounds is simply the wrong way of projecting things.
Dave Garland, do we sometimes take these ever-expanding population figures seriously? It seems that they come out all the time, but nobody really bats an eyelid.
Well, I think part of the problem there is that we assume that there's nothing we can do about it. It's inevitable, and I think that's setting the bar too low. And granted, I believe there is a lot of emotional baggage attached to the idea of population control. But what about population information? What's stopping us from just talking about overpopulation and making sure that everyone who is beginning a family in the coming century is making informed decisions about family size? We don't have to go to population control. We can just go to population information. You'd be surprised how many people have no idea that we're about to hit the 7 billion mark on the planet.
And yet we're happy enough to talk about global warming and what we can do about it, water conservation and what we can do about it. But the people that use all the water, the people that use the environment, are the ever-increasing population numbers. And it does seem to be a taboo subject amongst some governments. I mean, we talked about climate change, or we didn't, the politicians did at the recent G8 meeting, and they didn't resolve anything, Dr. Khurram.
Well, I think the issue is what you highlighted earlier, and what. Well, I think the issue is also what was highlighted earlier, which is how we communicate our messages and how we communicate our concerns. And granted, I think that the economic argument is certainly not going to be the only one that will fly or convince all. I think it's also important to know what you mentioned earlier in terms of the kinds of opposition to this language that comes across from many international organizations. And this is one of the reasons why the United Nations Population Fund has invested quite significantly in mobilizing many different constituencies, not only the political leadership and ministries of health and finance in different countries, but we've worked very concertedly over so many years with opinion leaders in different parts of the world, many of which we refer to as cultural agents of change. I think we're the only agency that actually has mobilized an interfaith network on population and development, which is composed of over 400 faith-based organizations who provide service delivery around the world and who are very much for the messages that we are talking about here today, which are absolutely critical and necessary for human development.
Well, if I bring in Dave Gardner here, while the UN does its work in its own way, are politicians missing the boat to a certain extent by not jumping on the UN's bandwagon as such and trying to find at least common ground or solution to overpopulation, actually tackling the subject head on?
Well, certainly the politicians are letting us down, but we have created an atmosphere where they're afraid of the political consequences of being honest about the population challenge. And we need to do everything we can to create an atmosphere where politicians can be emboldened to be frank with the population about the problems of overpopulation. We've got to beat down that door, and to the extent that the United Nations is doing very important work, but I would like to give them permission to be more direct and honest about the problem and speak more frankly about overpopulation.
Well, just hold that thought there for a moment, Dave, because sort of in the first part of the programme we've discussed the whole issue of population growth. It's often dealt with as an issue rather than a problem, but is that always the case? It is, after all, also a resource, human resource, and some countries have utilised this resource very well, making it an asset rather than a liability. For instance, the two most populated countries in the world, China and India. At 1.33 billion, China is the most populated country in the world, with an annual birth rate of 14 per 1,000 people. Now, last year, China's economy grew by a staggering 9.8%. India has a 1.16 billion people and a birth rate of 21.76 per 1,000. Its economy has posted an average growth rate of more than 7% in the decade since 1997, while growth depends on several factors like education, governance, economic structure. The startling population numbers have not stopped these countries from growing. Dave Gardner, an increased population, obviously, we just mentioned just a moment ago, is never discussed or is seen as a liability rather than an asset. It can be an asset if deployed properly, though, can't it?
Well, I think the mythology is that it can be an asset. Certainly there are a number of countries today that have programs designed to raise their fertility rate solely because those nations are concerned about increasing GDP year over year. But if you really think about it, it's a myth. An economy that meets the needs of, say, 1 million people can be as healthy, and in fact is healthier, than an economy that is meeting the needs of 1 billion people. If an economy has to be perpetually growing. In order to be successful, you've got a Ponzi scheme. And so that mythology about economic growth is clearly causing nations and communities around the world to either ignore the problems of overpopulation, or in some cases actually even try to increase their population. It's a mistake.
Sorry to interrupt there, Dave. Mr. Sen, would you agree with that? India has certainly a situation where it has a population of haves and have-nots, but does actually have a large proportion of the poorer section of community raising itself up into the lower middle and middle classes because it's managed to gain wealth.
Well, let me try and clear up a few, I think, misconceptions. To say that population has not been an issue in a large part of the developing world is simply incorrect. India had a population policy in 1956, well before climate change was even thought about. China's had a population for years as well. The fact of the matter is every country recognizes the need to have a population policy. But the question is population policy a simply one-way street, or does it have to be more nuanced? And I think recent experiences demand that we think about population policy rather than population control.
But I was going to bring in the fact that India had that policy since 1956, because, Dr. Khurram, both India and China, even Egypt, all have very different attitudes to how to look after their populations. From your knowledge, how different is their approach, and is there one approach that's better than another?
I'm not necessarily sure that one approach is better than the other. I think each approach is tailored to the particular challenges, constraints, and success stories that every single country has. What I think is important to nuance here is we're not talking about population control or population policy. We're talking about the need for investing in family planning, particularly at a time when, due to the economic crisis, we have much fewer resources devoted to this issue. And what's even more problematic is that where there is an intersection between women's health issues and family planning, at a time of economic crisis, we will tend to find that the investment isn't going where it should be, which is to ensure voluntary family planning, which enables access to information and resources and services for populations writ large. I think what's also important to nuance is that we've gone way beyond. Since '94, we have no longer referred to the aspect in terms of population control. We have had so many other features put very strongly on the agenda, such as the centrality of women's health to the entire issue of managing populations and being able to give a better human development for all. We also need to keep in mind, and this is very, very critical, that we are talking about a context in which, by centralizing women, this is not a luxury, nor is it an afterthought. It becomes a very critical procedure in ensuring human development, and at a time when we do have not just population growth, but it is the size and it is the rate of population growth. We're talking about contexts where population growth per se is a challenge, but the rate at which populations are growing far exceeds the services and the health system structures that are available and that can make sure that we don't have one woman dying a minute as a result of complications during childbirth, which are completely preventable.
But the reverse is also the case,
that we need to focus on.
Sorry, the reverse is also the case as well, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere. If I just bring in some statistics now, that you can reduce the population growth, and that becomes a problem too, because it sets a whole new set of challenges. For instance, the youth are generally the driving force in most economies, and with advanced science and technology improving life expectancy, the number of elderly people in the world increases. By reducing the birth rate, countries face the possibility of creating a ratio of old versus young. And new research out at the moment says it's a ticking time bomb. According to the World Health Organization, there were 600 million people aged 60 and over in 2000. That's around 10% of the population of the globe. It estimates that figure will rise to 1.2 billion by 2025. Can I just bring you in, Dave Gardner, here, now that we've seen those figures or we're hearing about them, that we do have this problem. You can have population growth in the Northern Hemisphere, countries such as Germany, the United Kingdom, America, all seeing, and Japan, all seeing their populations decrease, that will also increase the burden when you have a much larger ageing population who need to be looked after by a much younger population. That needs to be addressed too, doesn't it?
Well, it's certainly something that needs to be addressed. There's always a little bit of short-term pain when you dismantle a Ponzi scheme, but to prop up and perpetuate a Ponzi scheme just delays the pain and makes the pain a lot worse. The short-term challenges around population decline are minor compared to the challenges that we face from climate disruption, resource depletion, hunger and starvation, freshwater crises, fishery decline. Those problems are really serious and will make the challenges of adjusting to population decline seem very minor.
Pranab Sen, can I just ask you from an Indian point of view, what does the government say publicly about population growth? If you can give us an idea of what their long-term plan is in terms of not just controlling growth, but how they're going to deal with such a large population and where they're going to deploy and how they're going to deploy those in the rural areas and those in the urban areas.
Well, it is a complex issue and it necessarily has to be multi-pronged. But let me begin with the population issue. At present, the Indian government is targeting a total fertility rate of 2.1 as its intermediate target. What that basically means is that India will achieve population stabilization probably around 2045 or thereabouts. So we are not really looking at a sudden reduction in our population. What we are looking is a gradual tapering off and stabilization around the middle of the century. In a sense, this is a recognition of reality. It's a recognition that demographics rather than population is a much more complex issue. We also reaffirm the centrality of women in all of these processes because, again, I think we tend to keep forgetting that the burden of child rearing that women face can very quickly be overtaken by the burden of old age care, and which also falls disproportionately on women. So one really has to be a little more careful. There was a time when the old age issue was never on our radar screens, but now it is firmly there, and so one really has to discuss the issue of demography rather than population per se. And this is important, I think, not just for a large overpopulated country like India. I think it's critical for the world.
Dr. Akram, you were nodding in agreement there.
Yes, I wanted to add something. I think the point is that it's exactly an issue of demographics. It's also not just for India, but globally, and specifically in the context of the developing world. We have a problem of data. We have a problem where censuses are not able to be carried out, so we don't even know what the migration rate, what the death, mortality, and fertility rates are. We don't know what the differing age structures are. We have a huge data shortage still in this day and age, given all the communication and all the technology at our disposal. We still have a very serious and critical data shortage issue. And this is something that not just the United Nations, but every single mechanism out there still needs to work very hard to ensure. And that very much and very strongly relates to the problem of demography and human development as a whole.
Well, we shall see what happens, certainly when next year's speech comes along from the UN there. Unfortunately, my guess, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but thank you very much. In New York, Azakaram, she's a senior advisor at the United Nations Population Fund. In Denver, filmmaker Dave Gardner. And in New Delhi, Pranab Sen, Chief Statistician of India's National Statistical Commission. Thank you to my guests, and thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions for future programmes. Do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. You've been watching Inside Story. Thanks for your time and your company.